I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, the department that handles immigration, otherwise known as ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, reported for October a record number of detainees in its average daily population. These are immigrants coming across the border, picked up at county courthouses or actually at their homes or places of business and put in detention for some period of time. The record number now is at 44,631 as an average daily. Congress has only funded 40,520 for this year, and the president had requested 51,000. So, Bill, I think this raises several questions for conservatives. On the face of it, the first thing that conservatives always go to is the budgetary aspect of it, and here we have overspending. In addition, the Government Accountability Office has said in the past that ICE has not had the accountability measures and transparency in place to actually show how they're spending their money, and it is evident that they are transferring money out of Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and its own investigation unit, its own Homeland Security investigation unit, and the Coast Guard in order to fund the additional beds for this. So I think I'm going to break this down and handle just the budgetary aspect at this point, and then we'll get into the other aspect in a minute. What do you think about these unaccountable bureaucrats moving money around as they wish in order to fund this kind of enterprise, which is inherently unpredictable?
Taking from one ever-growing immortal bureaucracy and covering the shortfall of another one without raising taxes or going deeper into debt is not an optimal solution, but it sure could be worse than that. If they're taking money from FEMA, I happen to think this is a federal emergency. I think that the southern border is the greatest strategic interest that the United States has, and we better start facing up to it. And if it turns out that Congress allocated money for, just off the top of my head, 40,000 beds, and it turns out that we've got 50,000 detainees, that means that either we're catching more of them or more of them are coming in. In either case, ICE should have more money to deal with this. I consider this, as I say, to be just a national security issue and a homeland defense issue. So in terms of extra money going to ICE to detain illegal immigrants, I have no problem with that whatsoever. Now, if you're talking about the endless bloated bureaucracy, you know, it's a question of how much time do you have. It may surprise you, by the way, just thinking about it on the fly, that this kind of thing seems to fall in the extremely limited purview of what executive orders are supposed to be. Executive orders shouldn't be to change legislation. Executive orders sure shouldn't be to tell you how to buy insurance, shouldn't be able to legislate through executive order, because if you can, it's just dictation, and that's a dictatorship. But the idea that you've got an emergency situation and you've got a shortfall, you're not changing the legislation, you're not changing the will of the people, you're making an adjustment in case of an emergency, which I consider this to be, then on principle, nothing here really bothers me in terms of the actual transfer of money. But if you want to talk about the substructure, that's obviously something else.
Well, let's talk about that substructure, Bill, because I think my hearing of conservative complaints about government tend to trend toward the big bloated bureaucracy, except when it comes to immigration enforcement. In the case of immigration enforcement, we seem to have no major concerns about the big bloated bureaucracy and how much they spend and what they do. Is this a blind spot on the part of conservatives that they are not applying the same level of scrutiny to the Department of Homeland Security or for example, to ICE as they would to the IRS?
On the contrary, this is not only not a blind spot, this is a case of conservatives' acute vision. If you're talking about spending troves of money, and nobody wants to be spending as much money as we are, but if we're talking about government spending to protect and enforce the southern border is a key national security interest. It is definitely defined by the United States Constitution as a job for the federal government to do, and this is one of those cases where the spending and the target and everything else is well within the allocated powers of the U.S. Constitution. It is nothing inappropriate about ICE. You want to compare ICE to IRS, or if you want to compare it just or whatever to Health and Human Services, if you're saying that conservatives are complaining about Health and Human Services because every year they're $280 billion, and they want another $10 or $20 million for ICE in order to protect the border,
They
I'm
want a
not
lot
saying-
more than that, actually. And I guess I'm not talking about whether conservatives believe in the mission of ICE or the IRS. What I'm saying is, it seems like, and this happens on the other side of the political aisle as well, but conservatives are much more concerned about big bloated bureaucracies when it comes to functions of the government that they don't like. In this case, because we like the Pentagon, we like ICE, we like Department of Homeland Security.
Scott, the reason we like them is because they're constitutional.
So shouldn't they have to be accountable?
Them because well, of course they have to be accountable. It's a different argument. I'm talking about whether or not money is justified being spent on these things. We like the Department of Defense because the Department of Defense is constitutional. Its role is defined in the Constitution. It's essential for this country as a government. It's one of the very few things that a government and only a government can do. And the reason we like it is not because we think guns are cool, although we do. The reason we like it is because even though the Defense Department and their cost plus spending and so on is insanely inflated, at least we get something for our buck out of the U.S. military.
Well, that's what you're talking about,
Same thing for the Border Patrol.
But what I'm actually asking about is, when I think the Republican blind spot could be seen as saying, defense is important, southern border is important. And so therefore, if we start to look like we're being too hard on ICE about how it's spending money or how it's moving money around, then that may give Democrats an opening to attack us and say, hey, maybe ICE isn't necessary, maybe we need to cut their budget. Republicans, being afraid of that slippery slope, back off and basically say, hey, well, this agency is doing an important job, we should leave them alone.
I can't speak for Republicans, because if I could, we would be holding every single office in the country right now. So let me just speak to the principles. If the Democrats want to say to the American people, you've increased ICE by $2 billion, $5 billion, or whatever, and therefore you're in favor of a bloated bureaucracy, if they want to make that argument, I say bring it on. If you really actually think that the progressives are going to take a stand on smaller government just to score 1 point off of ICE, you're out of your mind. That's never going to happen. So, look, Scott, here's the situation. We've got a situation with a government that spends more money than the entire gross national product of China, which is a communist country, to run a government of the freest people in the world, presumably. That's a real problem. And in the scope of the real problem, there are enormous issues in terms of the Social Security Fund and entitlements and all the rest. Defense Department bloat, I'm not letting them off the hook. The whole cost plus procurement thing and the development of the F-35, the way that went, and the fact that we don't have any shipyards to maintain our existing Navy, let alone bring new ships online. All of these are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. It just seems to me that in the grand scheme of things, to say that this is putting us over a barrel just doesn't seem to really hold a lot of water to me.
So let's get away from the budget aspect of it for a minute and talk about the human aspect of it. The reason for this recent glut of immigrants who are now in detention here has to do with an increased number of arrests as well, as you might expect. And according to DHS is blaming this flood tide on immigrants who are making frivolous asylum claims in order to avoid deportation. Other sources, including ICE itself, says that the flood of immigrants is, in many cases, women with children who are coming over now that the Trump administration has dropped its so-called zero tolerance policy, where it was, as the liberals would say, separating families, separating parents from their children. So the Trump administration stopped that separation policy, and women and children are coming in rapidly. Bill, as a liberty-loving conservative person, a constitutionalist, shouldn't your first priority be the fact that you don't want people unnecessarily imprisoned?
No, my first obligation as a freedom-loving American is to protect the freedom of America. That's my first obligation. As far as people being in prison goes, that depends on what they did. Now, here's a little argument for our progressive friends who whine and cry about families being separated at the border. I think this is something that even they can understand. Let's say that you've got a family in San Francisco. You've got a father, you've got a mother, you've got the 6-year-old boy, Erasmus, and you've got the 4-year-old girl, Ophelia. Okay, so you decide that you're going to take your family to visit fabulous Japan. And because of the way you've got this whole thing figured out and a little bit of sleight of hand, you're able to get your family on board the airplane and you're on your way to Tokyo. And on your way to Tokyo, on the way into Tokyo, when they ask for your passports so that you can start filling things out, you reveal that you don't have any passports. So you get off of the airplane, you try to get into Japanese customs, and you say, well, we don't have passports. And they will look at you rather intensely. And you know what they're going to do, Scott? They're going to separate your family. They're going to take the father someplace and ask him what on earth possessed him to think that he could come into the Japanese country without a passport. And you know whose fault it will be for separating those families, Scott? You know who owns the blame for that separation of that family?
The president of Japan.
The prime minister of Japan. That's right. It's his fault. Right. Absolutely. It's entirely his fault. And the weeping and the crying and the gnashing, and wailing of teeth are obviously the fault of the Japanese prime minister and the Japanese government for their heartless, cruelless, vindictive, fascist separation of families, when in point of fact, there is no way on earth that the person who made the decision to make that trip, that person knew what was going to happen, they knew the consequences, knew it was illegal, knew all of this stuff. So
that's a good analogy, Bill.
But hold on. This is the important part. So to say that somebody like you or me or a liberal in San Francisco, let's say, to say that we all know, that you can't just walk into Japan without a passport, but some campesino is able to walk into America, you're doing two things. You're saying, first of all, this guy's not intelligent enough to understand that you require a passport to get into the United States, and that is racism on the part of the liberals. And the second thing you're doing is you're saying that they have the inability to make moral decisions, which is the enormous, serious blind spot of progressives. The idea that the poorer you are, the less ability to make your own decisions you have. That's why we need progressive Scots. So we have somebody to protect these poor, innocent little lambs who don't know anything better about this. I'm not unsympathetic to the idea of separate families, but if you don't want your family separated, maybe you shouldn't try to go into a country without a passport. That's just my first take on it, but that's certainly the protocols I would follow if I was going to go with my family to Australia, let's say.
Well, there are two factors in that analogy you just made that let me bring that back to ground with the actual situation that's happening. Because number one, the reason why people are leaving Guatemala and Honduras, for example, is they are fleeing violence and poverty and desperate circumstances there, which would not be the case if I was going from here to Japan. Number two, a lot of these people who are coming to the border are not trying to sneak across the border. They're stepping across the border and turning themselves into authorities immediately and applying for asylum because of their hardship circumstances. Doesn't that make your analogy a little bit flawed, or perhaps a lot flawed?
No, it doesn't make it a lot flawed, because the argument was not about asylum and was not about the conditions from which or to which you're going. It wasn't an asylum argument. It was a separation of families and who's responsible for that argument. If you want to take the asylum argument, you don't have to go any further than just last week when we discussed the fact that this 7,000-person caravan fleeing Honduras was offered asylum in Mexico and they turned it down. So it's not about asylum. And we all know it. We all know it's not about asylum. You can stay in Mexico. You can stay here and be free of the political oppression that you have back in Honduras. Welcome to Mexico. We're going to keep going. Now you're real estate shopping, Scott. Okay, it's not an asylum issue anymore. Now you're real estate shopping, and if you want to solve the problem of the wretched conditions in Honduras and Guatemala and Venezuela, then you're going to have to address the fact that those countries are made untenable and unlivable by the policies that the people put in place there. Hugo Chavez was voted in, apparently, enthusiastically and legally. He utterly destroyed the country. As we've been saying forever, the animals in the zoo starved to death. They eating their own dogs on the street. There's nothing to eat, not even pets anymore. And then they re-vote for another socialist. I mean, on some level, where do you have to ask yourself, where is their responsibility? And to say that they're not really responsible is a racist statement saying that they're not fully human. They know what they're doing. If they want a better life, Scott, I recommend they stay in Guatemala and fix Guatemala, because we have something worth coming to here in America. The reason people want to come to America is because it works. We work hard. We follow the rules. We do all of the things that make people successful. We're not the only ones in the world who do this. but there are successful countries and there are not successful countries. Very clear what those things are. It's a rule of law, and so on and so on and so on. And if you think that because we've succeeded by having the discipline to work hard and play by the rules, if you think that the consequence of that, our reward for that, is to let every single person in the world into this country because we've got things nice because we worked for it, well, I'm not going to buy that either. Now, I'm not saying that your poor Guatemalan farmer is in a position to vote himself better representatives and so on. But, the American Revolution started in America, and it started in America by Americans because we wanted a better life for ourselves. And until these countries realize that they are going to have to change their policies and change their corrupt, dictatorial ways, then the world is not, this problem is not going to go away. And the more people, and the more we send the message, hey, your country is just a terrible, horrible place, and it's a terrible, horrible place because of decisions that are made by people. The decisions made by the government of Guatemala and Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela and all the rest. Those are the people who are responsible for your plight, and until you address those issues, you are not going to be able to simply walk into our house. I'm sorry, it's the way it is. And I just think, the thing that's so amazing, Scott, you know what I think we ought to do to solve the problem of the rest of this world? I'm serious about this. I think we ought to take the text of the United States Constitution, which is top secret and highly classified, every single word of which utterly redacted. Nobody really knows what it says unless you can prove you're an American citizen with a DNA test. But I would say instead of locking the Constitution up and making sure that no one is ever able to read it, I say why don't we make the Constitution public? Why don't we say we'd be able to go on the internet and hit Google and suddenly realize, oh, holy cow, look at that. There's the United States Constitution. There's a blueprint for success. I don't even have to write it myself. Somebody else has already done it. Does it work? Yes. Why? Because I want to go there and I don't want to stay here.
It would take a miracle. Final question. The president is going to submit his 2019 budget request, and reportedly that budget request will actually ask for more funding for average daily beds in immigration detention facilities, bumping that up from last year's request of 51,000 up to 52,000, which of course will involve millions, if not billions, more spending than was allocated in 2018. But when President Trump sends that budget document over to Capitol Hill, he'll be sending it right into the hands, next to the gavel, of Nancy Pelosi, the new House Speaker. How does the president even hope to get the kind of funding he needs for this from a House of Representatives that is dominated by Democrats?
Now, let's be serious here, Scotty. There's a lot of stuff Donald Trump is not going to get from the House of Representatives now that we've lost the House. But if you're telling me that you think that Nancy Pelosi is stupid enough to say, no more money for illegal immigrants, that's not going to happen. We all know it's not going to happen. This is their brand. They're counting on these people. They're counting on these people to become American citizens, or certainly at least to vote. Whether they're citizens or not doesn't seem to matter much anymore. But look, we have illegal immigrants into this country, Scott, because there are some jobs that Americans just won't do. And one of those jobs is voting Democrat. So we have to import workers to come in and do the jobs that Americans won't do.
So you're saying, at first I thought you were saying that San Fran Nan would have a shared interest with the President of the United States, in that if you have these folks in detention, what it means is that you're actually processing their request for asylum and other factors related to immigration, and you're not just rebuffing them at the border as a wall would do. Are you saying that Nancy Pelosi might say, yeah, let's get more of these beds?
I'm saying that absent a border, absent a wall, absent any kind of actual limitation to people crossing the borders, this is not only the most humane, but apparently so far the most effective way of dealing with this. But as I said before, I'm not sure I buy this asylum argument. Now, it's not that I don't believe in asylum. Asylum is a very sacred idea among civilized people. So if these people are applying for asylum, I think the burden of proof is on them to show that this is not just business as usual in the country that they come from, that they've been selectively targeted, or that there are so many mass murders going on in their country that you could basically say the entire country qualifies for asylum. But again, qualifying for asylum does not mean qualifying for asylum in the United States. It's not the only country in the world where you can go and not get killed. And we keep coming back to this again and again, but it's the most clear example of the actual dynamic that you ever need to see when this giant refugee column of people seeking asylum is heading north to the United States. The president of Mexico says, you can stay here. And they say, I don't think so. No, thanks. That's not asylum.
Well, methods are many, principles are few, methods always change, and principles never do. As the daily news changes hour to hour, Bill Whittle's principles remain consistent, and you can enjoy them here 5 days a week at Bill Whittle Now. It's part of the effort by the members at BillWhittle.com through their contributions of $9.95 a month to ensure that these kinds of conversations are propagated and multiplied. And it's not just a conservative echo chamber. We actually engage the ideas of the opposition in ways that we hope will connect with some of them, but we know we'll connect with our members. Go ahead,
which
Bill.
is why we're paying Scott Otts so not much, but so lay off him, okay? He's doing his job of playing devil's advocate. I know a lot of you say, "Oh, Scott Ott is making these ridiculous arguments." He's making the arguments that the opposition makes, and by dealing with the arguments that they make, we can make a better case for defeating them. So please show some mercy, show some tenderness to this guy. He needs asylum, for God's sakes. He's utterly persecuted from left and right, and he deserves better.
I read all of those comments at YouTube and at BillWhittle.com as the commenters just playing devil's advocate themselves. So it's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.